Today I'm going to talk about inspiration. And I don't mean, the inspiration in terms of the rules of D&D, but instead, what are the sources that you mine for your storylines and encounters in your homebrewed world? Now, in past videos, I've gone over sources of inspiration in terms of gaming, like repurposing maps or looking at modules for inspiration. I cover the first level and setup of the Dungeon of the Mad Mage for that very purpose. But what about the real world out there? Because when you consider the real world from a vantage point of repurposing, experiences, places, or objects, you'll find that there are a whole host of sources out there. Today's video was in itself inspired by a visit that I paid to the Meijer Gardens and Sculpture Park here in Michigan. I knew what to expect. There were some greenhouses with exotic plants and a sculpture garden that you walked through. But I was not prepared. When I went to the sculpture garden, I said, oh my God, look at these objects. These are perfect for D&D. Around every corner, I saw sculptures that inspired me. Art as inspiration, art that I'm about to show you. Hello again, folks. KR King here, helping you homebrew your own D&D campaign. So, a point of order at the outset, the art that I'm going to be talking about for this video is monumental art. That is, art that is larger than life. Often created to be done outdoors. And, a large part of this reason is the art that I saw at the Meijer Sculpture Gardens was monumental art. It was very large. But another reason is that monumental art can give some flavor and verisimilitude to your world. Think about the statues of the Argonath in Lord of the Rings. They have no magic powers or intrinsic worth, except to impress upon anyone that views them that, whoever built these was very powerful. One of the 7 wonders of the ancient world was the Colossus of Rhodes, which told all who entered the harbor of Rhodes that this was a mighty and rich city. But of course, in the world of D&D, you have objects infused with magic power. So monumental art has a potential, extra source of awe to any that come across them. All right, so let's look at the first, sculpture that I saw at the Meijer Sculpture Garden to show you why, the minute I saw it, I realized this is perfect for, not only my, my own world, but as a source for a video. So this is called Light of the Moon for whatever reason. And I think when you look at it, you can see why I said, hey, this is a classic D&D statue. You have a face that is like 15 feet high. Well, of course, you can make it any size you want. Now, you may say, well, 15 feet high is not that, monumental. But if you think about the real face is like 12 inches high by 10 inches wide, that's a pretty damn big face. So you can use this just like the Argonath in Lord of the Rings. It's just a monument of some long-lost civilization, but you can also give it some kind of power. Now, if you see here, this one is on a base, so clearly it's not the head of some giant buried statue. Instead, it's an object that appears as it was meant to be by its creators. All right, so let's just say you leave this exactly as in the real world. What kind of powers does it have? Well, when I look at this in this face, part of me thinks it's an oracle or maybe a guardian, because I think of scrying powers through the eyes of this face. But, you can be creative here. Maybe it's some trapped creature. Think about Han Solo at the end of, The Empire Strikes Back when he gets carbonized. If the players, there's clues or there's something where they can free this giant creature, they may have an ally. They might get all sorts of information about this area, or they might be asked to go on, a quest with this creature to get back at whoever carbonized it. But, then you always want to try to go outside the box and say, okay, I'm going to take this idea, I'm inspired by this statue, but it's not a statue. So now you have this, face, this disembodied 15 face, wandering around the countryside. Perhaps it moves through the air, kind of a hovering thing. Perhaps it moves more quickly. Now, when I see this creature and I think about it, it's not a creature that needs to eat or sleep or anything, some kind of aberration. But maybe not. Maybe it supports itself, on the energy of living creatures. And of course, as I said, you can increase it to be gigantic, or you can make it small, make it human-sized, make it wandering around a dungeon, as a scrying device for whoever created the dungeon. And it goes around, it sees something, and it speaks. Maybe, whoever created it can see through its eyes. And maybe that person can speak through its mouth. The point is, it doesn't necessarily have to have deadly powers of attack to be something that, is creepy or is interesting to your players. And unlike, the Monumental that's just for itself, this would serve a purpose. So I took an image from the internet of this, giant face, and it brings up an interesting question, because when you are presenting something that is in the real world, either that you've seen and taken a picture of or you found on the internet, do you show the players that image, or do you just use your, sort of verbal description to, describe it to them? So if I found an illustration, I usually show it to the players just because my powers of description, I'm sort of okay, but sometimes they can get confused and not realize and come back and say, well, I thought it was this or that. So when you show them the picture, they always, have a good sense. The other thing that you can do is take the image and alter it using some software, things like Photoshop, Illustrator, or GIMP or whatever, to create, a more creative picture that looks more like the world of D&D. I've done this a lot, but I've also worked with that software a lot, partly because in the past I've done documentary films and things like that, and then of course doing this channel. So I think I'm going to do a video and I'm going to show how I created, some of the illustrations that I'm going to use in this video. That'll come later. So here's another statue that I saw at the Meijer Garden Sculpture Park. It's called Neuron, and it's basically a 44-foot high casting of, an artistic rendering of what a neuron looks like in the human brain. So here again, the monumental size and bizarre appearance said to me this could be a great statue or more in the world of D&D. So my first thought was to create a series of these as guardians, like node points set around some place that serve as power sources. If anyone tries to enter, go between them, they get blasted by damage. Now it could be the standard electrical damage like an electrical fence, but since it's neurons, I was thinking psychic damage. Now, of course, if you are like most campaigns set in a medieval setting, the players, characters aren't going to know anything about neurons. So it's a little bit of a meta joke. Once they get the psychic damage, maybe they'll figure this out. Maybe it's just one that, you have in private. Now, here's another interesting thing I've always found. When you create a fence, the power node, invisible fence thing, traditionally you think of it as, it does damage when you enter, go through there. And you take this damage and maybe you go through. Maybe you take the damage and then are repelled. You cannot enter it unless, depending on its height, you can fly over it or go under it in the ground. But, there's another way, is that when you enter, nothing happens to you, but when you try to exit, this happens. You can't get past. The idea here is it's basically like a trap, And again, if someone lives there or whatever, they want to find out who's been trespassing, what can I get from them? Can I kill them? All right, so the next thing you want to do is determine the damage, that these node points, these neurons do. Again, if I could say psychic damage, maybe low is 4d10, stunned for a minute. High might be, or middle might be 10d10, and then 12 or higher for high. You might increase the stun thing, or at the highest levels, maybe they're confused for a minute. A confusion spell is always interesting. And it's related to the psychic damage. One of the great things about this is it's a rare intelligence save, which can be very humorous because often players will use, in terms of a point buy system or whatever, they'll use, intelligence as a stat dump. But now let's get away from the statue concept and just imagine, these things as creatures or, automatons or aberrations or whatever moving around in your world. Again, it might just float above the surface, or it might revolve around these, these neuron stalks. And what is it? Maybe it's some kind of primitive elemental form. Maybe it's an area with tons of electrical activity. It's sort of like a ball lightning thing. And if you think it's some elemental form or the accumulation of, electricity in the air, you figure, well, it doesn't have any sentience, but could it? Because again, you're taking an image or some object that you saw and repurposing it for the world of D&D. So imagine if your players see this 40-foot high, crackling thing rolling towards them, and then telepathically it says, what are you doing here? And it might, discuss things with them or deliver 12d10 psychic damage. All right, so another statue that I saw that really fascinated me was this granite block called Untitled. It's 10 feet tall and 5 feet wide on all four sides. And then it has these 3 highly polished mirrors, 2 that are concave and 1 that is convex. So here again, you think, it's going to be static. It's sort of a guardian device or whatever. The mirrors could be used to scry, or they could be the power source for some kind of attack. I think of like laser beam kind of thing. Maybe it's some kind of bizarre speaker thing that sends out audio damage to those, that violate the area. So again, you can create a series of these, granite pillars with the mirrors to create a perimeter and barrier. You can also think about there's 3 of these mirrors, maybe each does a different thing. One is for scrying or communicating or whatever, and the others have some kind of power. But another idea is that this is an elevator that leads to a subterranean dungeon or whatever. So these, the mirrors provide scrying abilities so that whoever's down inside can say who's there, look them over, maybe let them in. Again, one of the mirrors could still be a defensive weapon. The thing I like about this square image could then be reflected in the construction of the dungeon below. Very linear, very organized, lawful, sort of like a Modron complex. All right, so you have these abstract forms, but you also have things that kind of just appear as they are, but also, very rich sources of inspiration for things in D&D. Because representative statues are often placed as guards, around tombs, castles, whatever. They don't have any power. They're just there in a symbolic way, guarding the area. All right, so the first one is the spider statue. Now, again, when players come across a statue of a giant spider, this one is 8 feet tall, they are going to be highly suspicious. They are going to assume that as soon as they pass some point, or do something, the spider is going to come to life and attack them. And of course, you can do just that, give it some hit points depending on its size, but something that's realistic. If it's large like this, you can make it, because it's metallic, you can give it a really high armor class, and then decide the DC of its poison bite and what exactly it does. But again, it doesn't have to be so obvious. What if the spider statue just is there and the players move around? Then they discover some item or invocation or something which brings it back to life. Maybe it's their servant. Maybe one of the players that does this invocation can mount this spider and ride along on it. It might be a tremendous mount, speed with the 8 legs. Obviously, it can do its bite. And the psychological impact of a humanoid riding in on an 8-foot spider. And once again, you don't have to, make it a statue at all. You're using this as inspiration. Maybe there's these metallic spiders in your world, either a single one or a group of them somewhere. Maybe they act as mounts for some other NPCs or creatures. And with its metallic origin, however that came to be, because again, it's a game, think about its bite as having something related to the metallic origin. Maybe it can only eat metal, so it first wraps the victim in some kind of metal spikes, or they're out and they begin to petrify so that the spider can devour them. All right, so then you can have something that seems totally realistic, but just as a statue is giant. Here is this statue that's called an American horse, which is clearly a giant horse. In fact, it is dedicated to a series of drawings that Leonardo da Vinci did centuries ago for a proposed statue. So again, it could just be the guardian of a tomb, just there to invoke awe. But of course, if you want, it could be something that could come to life, again, as servants for the players. Maybe you could say on this is 24 feet tall, maybe 3 people could ride, and because it's magical, they don't fall off. You could make it bigger or smaller, whatever. Your movement rate is obviously super increased, and its attack abilities would be intense. And then you go from the realistic horse to the fantastical with this horse called Cabin Creek. So Cabin Creek is a just about 8-foot tall horse that's made out of bronze castings that were taken from actual pieces of wood. So to me, obviously, this sort of invokes some kind of undead horse, perhaps ridden by a necromancer or by some other undead entity. But, it could just be a construct of some kind found by the players, an aberration that somehow got onto the material plane. It doesn't have to be evil or hostile or whatever, even though its appearance kind of makes you think that can fool the players. All right, and finally, I have to include this statue called Bent of Mind, because it invokes that mystery and sense of dread or something in the players. Obviously it looks sort of like a black pudding. In actuality, it is 7 feet high, but you could certainly make it bigger or smaller depending on how you want to use it. Now, the obvious choice here is to make it some form of a black pudding or whatever that, is activated when the players, come in contact with it or near it or whatever. But, you can get a little more creative here. What if you had a creature like this that appears that looks like it's an ooze, so the players react, oh my God. But in fact, it's something different. Something along the line of the creature that I saw in the movie The Abyss. It might be highly intelligent, it might be very curious about the players. It could be, some aberration from another plane that's trapped here. what powers does it possess? Could it communicate with the players? And what does it want? And here again, this isn't going to be a statue. It's just going to be some creature that the players encounter. Because as always, you are using this image or this statue that you see to inspire you to create something that is unique to your world that the players have never encountered before and that they have to figure out. All right, so that's just a few of the statues that I saw at the Meijer Gardens Sculpture Park. So I'm going to include a link to this, their website in the description below. Check it out. There's a ton of other statues in there that might inspire you. And if you like my channel, please subscribe. I'm always looking for more. Leave some comments because I love each one, and tell me about some of the real life experiences, places, or objects that have inspired you to create storylines, creatures or encounters in your world. But as always, please keep playing D&D and tell somebody else about it.